Book Talk begins at 8 minutes and 41 seconds. Welcome to CraftLit, the podcast for crafters who love books. My name is Heather Ordover, and I'm podcasting from where the Delaware River meets the Old York Road, New Hope, Pennsylvania. Episode 654, Speed Bumps. This episode of CraftLit is brought to you by our fabulous patrons at patreon.com and our channel members at YouTube. This week we would like to highlight Julie Mead, Cheryl Ann Schmidt, Catherine Snyder, Marta Poling, and Terry J. Rao. Thank you so much. We could not do this without you. Well, hello. How are you? I've hit a speed bump. There's a reason for the name today. I got a call Friday. For those of you who've been listening for a long time, I don't know if it's going to be as big a shock to you as it is to me, but in 2014, I got diagnosed with narcolepsy. I've been medicated for it since. Medicated narcolepsy is not great, but it's better than unmedicated narcolepsy because I know it sounds really like, wow, Heather, you mean you have to sleep all the time? That just sucks. I take naps, but the difference is when you take a nap, it lets you feel refreshed when you wake up. And when I take a nap, I just don't feel any better at all. Slightly less sleepy, but I know it won't last. So I got a call from the sleep doctor early Friday morning, which I really appreciated from him getting to me as fast as he could, that the pharmacy had called and said that because in my physical in January, they did an EKG that showed a right bundle branch block. I think that's the right order. Yeah, right bundle branch block. Apparently, stimulant medications like the ones that I take for narcolepsy have this possible side effect with a right bundle branch block. And that possible side effect is, I'm not kidding, sudden death, apparently. So I can't take any narcolepsy meds. The other ones that are not stimulants don't work on me. They just have never worked on me. Kind of like how anesthetics don't really work on me very well. Tylenol doesn't work, that kind of thing. So we hit a little bit of a speed bump there. I don't know what this means. Obviously, it means I've been sleeping a lot. I don't know what that's going to mean for my ability to get podcasts out every week. I will see the cardiologist May 28th, 2024, so I will know more then. I am very much hoping that he will look at whatever and say, no, it's fine as long as you don't go over this amount or this dosage or whatever. You'll be fine. I'm hopeful, but not confident or even particularly expecting anything good to happen right now. So yeah, I don't know what's going to happen. I will make sure that I let you know through the newsletter and on the Facebook group. And I think we can now do posts on YouTube as well. So if something else happens, you will know. And in the meantime, I'm going to try and keep getting Emma out to you because it's something for me to look forward to too. So yeah, by the time this airs, we will have chosen our 2 raffle winners for the gorgeous little coasters and bookmarks from Susan. We will have a new raffle for May. I don't have it set up yet because I forgot that I had to record early today because I'm seeing another doctor tomorrow. This week, everything's happening earlier, which threw me off. So I'm sorry about that, but there will be more things raffled for you on next week's episode. And it's not the end of April yet, so we haven't chosen the winners of this month's raffle. So again, we'll be posting that stuff. You'll get an email from me asking for your shipping address if you win. Yeah, I'm excited. I can't wait for other people to get an opportunity to see how gorgeous Susan's work is, because it's awfully special to have such talented people in the craft literati. We do have a call from Liz in Tucson, and Liz makes a really excellent point, I think, about the chapter early on. I think she says it's episode 2. It's the chapter where it's Knightley and Mrs. Weston, Miss Taylor, talking about Emma specifically. So let's listen to what Liz has to say.
Hi, this is Liz in Tucson. I am listening to the second episode about Emma and thinking about that wonderful chapter with when there's two rational people talking about Emma, and yes, how rare that is. And I think that is largely because this is the only one of Austen's books where we have the hero and the heroine surrounded by mostly rational people. All of the other books, most of the extraneous characters are silly. But here, it's Emma. It's Emma who is silly and wrong so much. And so I think that's why this particular chapter can only exist in this book. Thanks. Love what you do. Bye.
So I think Liz is onto something, that this probably accounts for at least some of people's reactions, negative reactions to Emma, that Emma is not Elizabeth Bennet. Elizabeth Bennet is quite wise for her age. And it's interesting, right? Because Pride and Prejudice, Sense and Sensibility, which is dealing with kind of the silly and the serious personality types as a duality. In Pride and Prejudice, she gets to be our Jo March. She gets to be, Elizabeth Bennet gets to be our proxy in the story. We would like to think of ourselves as being more like Elizabeth than Miss Bingley or whatever. Emma's different, though. And Jane Austen knew this. She set out on purpose to do it this way. And I have a feeling that some of that, as counterintuitive as it seems, some of that's probably because she's older when she's writing this considerably. This is the last of her books to get published, outside of like Lady Susan that gets published way down the line. But this and Persuasion are her lastest books. And they do have a very different vibe from all of her other books. So yeah, having Emma being the lead character, the character who we should be aligning ourselves the most closely with in our own mind as we read the book, it's kind of hard to do that sometimes, because sometimes she doesn't really say things the way that we would like her to. And I don't think she's supposed to. But I think that one of the things that does for us is it gives us an opportunity to examine our reasoning behind what we do and our motives behind what we do. And I like that. I think it's not a bad thing. All right. Things to know before we listen. We're going to do chapters 10 and 11 today. There are some terms that I've never come across. The very first one, I'm sure that if you pay more attention to trees, or you have property with trees on them, or if you are in the UK, you've probably heard of this before. Pollards, Pollards. We're going to show you a picture of what pollards look like on the YouTube video. I have definitely seen trees that have been treated this way. The distinction that was made that I thought was interesting was there are ways to prune trees that can do damage, which is, if I'd been let loose on a tree, I'm sure that's exactly what I would have done with my not green thumb. But you can also trim trees back. I mean, obviously you can do things like bonsai trees. That's not what we're talking about. You can trim trees back kind of the way that thinning scissors work. You know, a thinning scissor has the serrated blade so that you don't cut all of the hair straight across. You're cutting some of the hair as you go straight across. And that lightens the load. I know for people with really thick hair, those thinning scissors can be a godsend. This is kind of the same thing, but it's during the months when the tree is dormant, you go in and you take off branches at a certain height, and you take them off a very specific way so that they will come back bushier. Like if you pinch the tops of a basil plant right before it starts to flower, that will force new growth down below that, and that makes your plant bigger, bushier, better, more basally. This is true for the trees as well. They do start to look a little weird over time, but one of the reasons that this was done was not only to keep control of the trees, because this also stops root growth. So if you're trying to keep a tree from, say, rooting under your house's foundations and doing bad damage to them, this is a way to control them. They're not going to get huge, but they're also not going to get damaged. Your house is not going to get damaged. Everybody wins, right? The other reason that this was done was because the branches that are trimmed can be reused, and they certainly were reused at this time as firewood. Obviously, if it was very small sticks, then it would be good kindling. You just have to cure it and dry it. But yeah, if you were cutting off decent sized branches, if you have trees that grow quickly, and there are some that do, it was a way to use your trees as a renewable resource for firewood, which I did not know. I didn't know that that option existed at all. So I thought that was kind of cool. There's a very famous Emma speech. Well, famous in that this is one of those speeches that gets done in every movie version that I've seen, where she talks, we're on the chapter where she and Harriet are going to be talking about getting married, and we will finally hear Emma's reasoning behind her saying that she does not want to get married. And one of the things that she says repeatedly is, I do not want employment. I do not want consequence. These are things that she doesn't lack. It's not that she has no desire for them. It's that she doesn't even need to think about desire because she has those things already. So I am not in want of money. The term old maid pops up in this chapter. This is still chapter 10. That's been around since like the 1500s. People have used that as a term. And of course, we know that spinster, which became a synonym for old maid, spinster was the women who were sitting around spinning yarn all day. That was at least a profitable thing you could do if you were lucky enough to have a spinning wheel. So I no longer think of either of these terms in a negative way. I know that they are portrayed that way, but now I can't help but think, no, being a spinster, there's worse things. Although if you're spinning flax, that starts to hurt. So undistinguishing gets used in a kind of odd way. It is if you have no discernment, if you don't have the ability to judge something as particularly beautiful or particularly valuable or particularly useful, you would have a lack of discernment. And the way Jane Austen says that is undistinguishing. So it's not like being a distinguished person. It's different than that. Sixpence is half of a shilling. So if you have a shilling and you get rid of a sixpence, you've gotten rid of half of your shilling. And a shilling, there are 20 shillings in a pound, because this is back when we were still on the the base 12 system in England. So 1 pound is 20 shillings. 1 shilling is 12 pennies. So sixpence is half of that. And yeah, that's all. It's a quick thing that goes by, but it does get the point across that this is somebody who isn't driven by money. You're going to hear the word illiberal used to mean small-minded. So illiberal, I-L, illiberal, small-minded. Carpet work. This is a rabbit hole that I went down, and I hope that somebody who's listening can help with this. Carpet work, according to one of the annotations in the book that I have, she brings up that carpet work gets mentioned in Sense and Sensibility and Mansfield Park. And it's almost always something, well, in Jane Austen's books, it's something that is being attached to older women. Now, when I think of carpet work, I think of only two things: tying carpets, like Persian rugs, which I don't think we're talking about here, but then rag rugs, but those aren't carpets. But then I think what they're talking about is canvas-backed, wool-based embroidery. There are different stitches that you can do that would give you 2 layers of wool plus the canvas backing so that the carpet would actually be thick enough to make things warm. I found a reference to somebody's embroidered carpet work that had become the bed for the dog, which from the same time period, which I thought, well, happy doggy. Both beauty and warmth all in the same place at the same time. But I couldn't find any details like did you use a tambour frame? Did you have to use canvas? Could this have been done on a different fabric? How flexible was this? Why did this get associated with older women? My guess is that this is needlework that does not require good eyesight. That's my guess, but I do not know, because things like petty point, embroidery, petty point, needlepoint, tent stitch, all these things, those require a little bit more in the way of eyesight. So that's just my guess. But I would love to know if somebody knows. The Jane Austen Center site just mentions the fact that carpet work shows up in her books. The end. Stomachers. So if you've watched Abby Cox, or I know we have a lot of costumers who listen to the shows, as well as reenactors and people who go to Ren fairs and do cosplay. A stomacher getting mentioned in a Jane Austen book really stood out to me. So I went down that rabbit hole, and yes, I'm not wrong. Around 1780, 1790, stomachers died out. Now, stomachers were the not really rigid, but certainly more stiffened, usually triangular, but not always, triangular front pieces that went from one side of the bodice to the other side of the bodice. This allowed you to gain weight, lose weight, have babies, because you could make the bodice strings where you're getting laced in, the bodice laces, you could make them tighter or looser depending on what you needed. And then all you would have to do is make a different stomacher, a bigger one if you needed bigger and a smaller one if you needed smaller. And that is a huge amount of money saved, because that's not having to either replace the entire bodice, which you would have had to do by like 1850. I don't think you could have, maybe even 1840, I don't think you could have gotten away with not having to rebuild a dress. And then you get into, letting dresses out, taking dresses in. It's a lot of work. But stomachers, if you're thinking, wow, Regency dresses, I don't see them using stomachers, and you're correct, they don't. When Emma mentions stomachers, patterns for a stomacher, she's talking specifically about something that an older woman would have worked on. It's kind of like whist having taken over for cotillion. The stomachers are out of style, and we are supposed to know that. Knit garters. I found actually a lovely video that shows just how stretchy and confidently you could hold up stockings. I've always thought that garters must just fall down all the time, but they're knit in, I know this will be shocking, garter stitch, which is very stretchy. So I'm going to share that video with you, and then if you are interested, you can go take a look at how these are constructed and how they're used. A footstep. There's a mention of a tottering footstep still in chapter 10. That's like a little wooden step, like if you were crossing a stile to get off of one person's property and into another person's property, because there's the right of way. Everybody has the right to walk across the countryside as long as you do it correctly. Using the stiles would be one of those things. So a tottering footstep would be the little wooden step up that you would cross over on with style. Pails. So I think we've talked about this a long time ago on CraftLit. Beyond the Pale is not at all the image that I had in my mind. Pales are palisades, it's the same root. Um, White picket fences are pales, the kind of fencing that we think of as being picket fences nowadays. Those are pales. So if you are beyond the pale, you are outside of the safety range of your area. This is not getting used this way right here. It's being used much more casually, that you could see somebody's fencing, somebody's pale before you get to their house. That's all that is. At the beginning of chapter 11, Emma is going to mention like it's a thing, long vacation. And it is a thing. The court system, so if you think back to Sidney Carton and Tale of Two Cities at Lincoln's Inn, or God, Court of Chancery in Bleak House, dear Lord, the Inns of Court, Lincoln's Inn, the Temple, Middle Temple, Inner Temple, all of these inns were places where barristers were trained and practiced the law in London. And they set specific ranges, date ranges for vacations. And I found this to be really interesting because it's not like the third week of July through the first week of October. For example, the long vacation in 1813 went from July 7th to November 6th. But then in 1814, it went from June 29th, so at least a week's difference, to November 7th. So yeah, it's not I mean, it's within the same ballpark. I get it. But it did vary quite a lot, and it kept varying. And I don't know, people who live in and around London, is there still a time period that's considered a quote unquote long vacation? Because it sounds from what I was reading like, yes, it's not this long anymore, but this is a thing. Which maybe that carried over into New York, because I know in New York City, it's very much the entire city empties out the last 2 weeks of August. Everybody's expected, you're probably going to go on vacation, you're probably going to go to the beach. And the city is noticeably less dense with people those last 2 weeks. So I don't know, maybe that's just the New York version of the quote unquote long vacation. Forestalling, Fore, stalling, is anticipating. It has nothing to do with stalling. It's just anticipating something that's coming. There's going to be a reference to the common rate of social intercourse at the end of our second chapter today, chapter 11. The common rate of social intercourse is like the generally accepted form of how society would work. So like how often you're supposed to visit, how to pay a call, when to pay a call, how to do a sick visit, when to have a party, who to invite to the party, all of that would be the common rate. And forbearance, which comes in the very next sentence, is patient self-control. Forbear, patient self-control. Not a word that I think we would use with Emma quite yet. All right, let's listen to chapters 10 and 11 of Emma by Jane Austen. If you are listening to a different version than the one that we are playing for you here, please fast wind to 49 minutes. All right, here we go.
Chapter 10. Though now the middle of December, there had yet been no weather to prevent the young ladies from tolerably regular exercise, and on the morrow Emma had a charitable visit to pay to a poor sick family who lived a little way out of Highbury. Their road to this detached cottage was down Vicarage Lane, a lane leading at right angles from the broad though irregular main street of the place, and, as may be inferred, containing the blessed abode of Mr. Elton. A few inferior dwellings were first to be passed, and then about a quarter of a mile down the lane rose the vicarage, an old and not very good house, almost as close to the road as it could be. It had no advantage of situation, but had been very much smartened up by the present proprietor, and such as it was, there could be no possibility of the two friends passing it without a slackened pace and observing eyes. Emma's remark was, "There it is. There go you and your riddle book one of these days." Harriet's was, Oh, what a sweet house! How very beautiful! There are the yellow curtains that Miss Nash admires so much." "I do not often walk this way now," said Emma as they proceeded, "but then there will be an inducement, and I shall gradually get intimately acquainted with all the hedges, gates, pools, and pollards of this part of Highbury." Harriet, she found, had never in her life been inside the vicarage, and her curiosity to see it was so extreme, that, considering exteriors and probabilities, Emma could only class it as a proof of love, with Mr. Elton's seeing ready wit in her. "I wish we could contrive it," said she, "but I cannot think of any tolerable pretence for going in. No servant that I want to inquire about of his housekeeper, no message from my father." She pondered, but could think of nothing. After a mutual silence of some minutes, Harriet thus began again. "I do so wonder, Miss Woodhouse, that you should not be married, or going to be married, so charming as you are." Emma laughed and replied, "My being charming, Harriet, is not quite enough to induce me to marry. I must find other people charming, one other person at least. And I am not only not going to be married at present, but have very little intention of ever marrying at all." "Ah, so you say, but I cannot believe it." "I must see somebody very superior to any one I have seen yet to be tempted. Mr. Elton, you know," recollecting herself, "is out of the question, and I do not wish to see any such person. I would rather not be tempted. I really cannot change for the better. If I were to marry, I must expect to repent it." "Dear me, it is so odd to hear a woman talk so." "I have none of the usual inducements of women to marry. Were I to fall in love, indeed, it would be a different thing. But I have never been in love. It is not my way, or my nature, and I do not think I ever shall. And without love, I am sure I should be a fool to change such a situation as mine. Fortune I do not want. Employment I do not want. Consequence I do not want. I believe few married women are half as much mistress of their husband's house as I am of Hartfield, and never, never could I expect to be so truly beloved and important, so always first and always right in any man's eyes, as I am in my father's." "But then to be an old maid at last, like Miss Bates!" "That is as formidable an image as you could present, Harriet, and if I thought I should ever be like Miss Bates, so silly, so satisfied, so smiling, so prosing, so undistinguishing and unfastidious, and so apt to tell everything relative to everybody about me, I would marry to-morrow. But between us, I am convinced there can never be any likeness, except in being unmarried." "But still, you will be an old maid, and that's so dreadful." "Never mind, Harriet, I shall not be a poor old maid, and it is poverty only which makes celibacy contemptible to a generous public. A single woman with a very narrow income must be a ridiculous, disagreeable old maid. The proper sport of boys and girls, but a single woman of good fortune is always respectable, and may be as sensible and pleasant as anybody else, and the distinction is not quite so much against the candour and common sense of the world as appears at first, for a very narrow income has a tendency to contract the mind and sour the temper. Those who can barely live, and who live perforce in a very small and generally very inferior society, may well be illiberal and cross. This does not apply, however, to Miss Bates. She is only too good-natured and too silly to suit me, but in general she is very much to the taste of everybody, though single and though poor. Poverty certainly has not contracted her mind. I really believe if she had only a shilling in the world, she would be very likely to give away sixpence of it, and nobody is afraid of her. That is a great charm." "Dear me, but what shall you do? How shall you employ yourself when you grow old?" "If I know myself, Harriet, mine is an active, busy mind, with a great many independent resources, and I do not perceive why I should be in more want of employment at 40 or 50 than 21. Woman's usual occupations of hand and mind will be as open to me then as they are now, or with no important variation. If I draw less, I shall read more. If I give up music, I shall take to carpet work. And as for objects of interest, objects of the affections, which is in truth the great point of inferiority, the want of which is really the great evil to be avoided in not marrying, I shall be very well off, with all the children of a sister I love so much to care about. There will be enough of them, in all probability, to supply every sort of sensation that declining life can need. There will be enough for every hope and every fear, and though my attachment to none can equal that of a parent, it suits my ideas of comfort better than what is warmer and blinder. My nephews and nieces! I shall often have a niece with me." "Do you know Miss Bates's niece? That is, I know you must have seen her 100 times, but are you acquainted?" "Oh, yes, we are always forced to be acquainted whenever she comes to Highbury. By the by, that is almost enough to put one out of conceit with a niece. Heaven forbid, at least, that I should ever bore people half so much about all the Knightleys together as she does about Jane Fairfax. One is sick of the very name of Jane Fairfax. Every letter from her is read 40 times over, her compliments to all friends go round and round again, and if she does but send her aunt the pattern of a stomacher, or knit a pair of garters for her grandmother, one hears of nothing else for a month. I wish Jane Fairfax very well, but she tires me to death." They were now approaching the cottage, and all idle topics were superseded. Emma was very compassionate, and the distresses of the poor were as sure of relief from her personal attention and kindness, her counsel and her patience, as from her purse. She understood their ways, could allow for their ignorance and their temptations, had no romantic expectations of extraordinary virtue from those for whom education had done so little, entered into their troubles with ready sympathy, and always gave her assistance with as much intelligence as good-will. In the present instance it was sickness and poverty together which she came to visit, and after remaining there as long as she could give comfort or advice, she quitted the cottage with such an impression of the scene as made her say to Harriet as they walked away, "These are the sights, Harriet, to do one good. How trifling they make everything else appear! I feel now as if I could think of nothing but these poor creatures all the rest of the day, and yet who can say how soon it may all vanish from my mind?" "Very true," said Harriet. "Poor creatures! One can think of nothing else." "And really I do not think the impression will soon be over," said Emma, as she crossed the low hedge and tottering footstep which ended the narrow slippery path through the cottage garden, and brought them into the lane again. "I do not think it will," stopping to look once more at all the outward wretchedness of the place, and recall the still greater within. "Oh, dear no," said her companion. They walked on. The lane made a slight bend, and when that bend was passed, Mr. Elton was immediately in sight, and so near as to give Emma time only to say further, "Ah, Harriet, here comes a very sudden trial of our stability and good thoughts. Well," smiling, "I hope it may be allowed that if compassion has produced exertion and relief to the sufferers, it has done all that is truly important. If we feel for the wretched enough to do all we can for them, the rest is empty sympathy, only distressing to ourselves." Harriet could just answer, "Oh dear, yes," before the gentleman joined them. The wants and sufferings of the poor family, however, were the first subject on meeting. He had been going to call on them. His visit he would now defer, but they had a very interesting parley about what could be done and what should be done. Mr. Elton then turned back to accompany them. "To fall in with each other on such an errand as this," thought Emma, "to meet in a charitable scheme, this will bring a great increase of love on each side. I should not wonder if it were to bring on the Declaration. It must, if I were not here. I wish I were anywhere else." Anxious to separate herself from them as far as she could, she soon afterwards took possession of a narrow footpath, a little raised on one side of the lane, leaving them together in the main road. But she had not been there 2 minutes, when she found that Harriet's habits of dependence and imitation were bringing her up too, and that in short they would both be soon after her. This would not do. She immediately stopped, under pretence of having some alteration to make in the lacing of her half-boot, and stooping down in complete occupation of the footpath, begged them to have the goodness to walk on, and she would follow in half a minute. They did as they were desired, and by the time she judged it reasonable to have done with her boot, she had the comfort of farther delay in her power, being overtaken by a child from the cottage, setting out according to orders with her pitcher, to fetch broth from Hartfield. To walk by the side of this child, and to talk to and question her, was the most natural thing in the world, or would have been the most natural, had she been acting just then without design, and by this means the others were still able to keep ahead, without any obligation of waiting for her. She gained on them, however, involuntarily. The child's pace was quick, and theirs rather slow, and she was the more concerned at it, from their being evidently in a conversation which interested them. Mr. Elton was speaking with animation, Harriet listening with a very pleased attention, and Emma, having sent the child on, was beginning to think how she might draw back a little more, when they both looked around, and she was obliged to join them. Mr. Elton was still talking, still engaged in some interesting detail, and Emma experienced some disappointment when she found that he was only giving his fair companion an account of the yesterday's party at his friend Cole's, and that she was come in herself for the Stilton cheese, the North Wiltshire, the butter, the celery, the beetroot, and all the dessert. "This would soon have led to something better, of course," was her consoling reflection. "Anything interests between those who love, and anything will serve as introduction to what is near the heart. If I could but have kept longer away!" They now walked on together quietly, till within view of the vicarage pales, when a sudden resolution, of at least getting Harriet into the house, made her again find something very much amiss about her boot, and fall behind to arrange it once more. She then broke the lace off short, and, dexterously throwing it into a ditch, was presently obliged to entreat them to stop, and acknowledged her inability to put herself to rights so as to be able to walk home in tolerable comfort. "Part of my lace is gone," said she, "and I do not know how I am to contrive. I really am a most troublesome companion to you both, but I hope I am not often so ill-equipped. Mr. Elton, I must beg leave to stop at your house, and ask your housekeeper for a bit of riband or string, or anything just to keep my boot on." Mr. Elton looked all happiness at this proposition, and nothing could exceed his alertness and attention in conducting them into his house, and endeavouring to make everything appear to advantage. The room they were taken into was the one he chiefly occupied, and looking forwards, behind it was another with which it immediately communicated. The door between them was open, and Emma passed into it with the housekeeper to receive her assistance in the most comfortable manner. She was obliged to leave the door ajar as she found it, but she fully intended that Mr. Elton should close it. It was not closed, however, it still remained ajar, but by engaging the housekeeper in incessant conversation, she hoped to make it practicable for him to choose his own subject in the adjoining room. For 10 minutes she could hear nothing but herself. It could be protracted no longer. She was then obliged to be finished and make her appearance. The lovers were standing together at one of the windows. It had a most favourable aspect, and for half a minute Emma felt the glory of having schemed successfully. But it would not do. He had not come to the point. He had been most agreeable, most delightful. He had told Harriet that he had seen them go by, and had purposely followed them. Other little gallantries and allusions had been dropped, but nothing serious. "Cautious, very cautious," thought Emma. "He advances inch by inch, and will hazard nothing till he believes himself secure." Still, however, though everything had not been accomplished by her ingenious device, she could not but flatter herself that it had been the occasion of much present enjoyment to both, and must be leading them forward to the great event. Chapter 11. Mr. Elton must now be left to himself. It was no longer in Emma's power to superintend his happiness or quicken his measures. The coming of her sister's family was so very near at hand, that first in anticipation, and then in reality, it became henceforth her prime object of interest, and during the 10 days of their stay at Hartfield it was not to be expected, she did not herself expect, that anything beyond occasional fortuitous assistance could be afforded by her to the lovers. They might advance rapidly if they would, however. They must advance somehow or other whether they would or no. She hardly wished to have more leisure for them. There are people, who the more you do for them, the less they will do for themselves. Mr. and Mrs. John Knightley, from having been longer than usual absent from Surrey, were exciting of course rather more than the usual interest. Till this year, every long vacation since their marriage had been divided between Hartfield and Donwell Abbey, but all the holidays of this autumn had been given to sea-bathing for the children, and it was therefore many months since they had been seen in a regular way by their Surrey connections, or seen at all by Mr. Woodhouse, who could not be induced to get so far as London, even for poor Isabella's sake, and who consequently was now most nervously and apprehensively happy in forestalling this too short visit. He thought much of the evils of the journey for her, and not a little of the fatigues of his own horses and coachman, who were to bring some of the party the last half of the way. But his alarms were needless, the 16 miles being happily accomplished, and Mr. and Mrs. John Knightley, their 5 children, and a competent number of nursery-maids, all reaching Hartfield in safety. The bustle and joy of such an arrival, the many to be talked to, welcomed, encouraged, and variously dispersed and disposed of, produced a noise and confusion which his nerves could not have borne under any other cause, nor have endured much longer even for this. But the ways of Hartfield and the feelings of her father were so respected by Mrs. John Knightley, that in spite of maternal solicitude for the immediate enjoyment of her little ones, and for their having instantly all the liberty and attendance, all the eating and drinking and sleeping and playing which they could possibly wish for, without the smallest delay, the children were never allowed to be long a disturbance to him, either in themselves or in any restless attendance on them. Mrs. John Knightley was a pretty, elegant little woman, of gentle, quiet manners, and a disposition remarkably amiable and affectionate, wrapped up in her family, a devoted wife, a doting mother, and so tenderly attached to her father and sister that, but for these higher ties, a warmer love might have seemed impossible. She could never see a fault in any of them. She was not a woman of strong understanding or any quickness, and with this resemblance of her father, she inherited also much of his constitution, was delicate in her own health, over-careful of that of her children, had many fears and many nerves, and was as fond of her own Mr. Wingfield in town as her father could be of Mr. Perry. They were alike, too, in a general benevolence of temper, and a strong habit of regard for every old acquaintance. Mr. John Knightley was a tall, gentlemanlike, and very clever man, rising in his profession, domestic and respectable in his private character, but with reserved manners which prevented his being generally pleasing, and capable of being sometimes out of humour. He was not an ill-tempered man, not so often unreasonably cross as to deserve such a reproach, but his temper was not his great perfection, and indeed with such a worshipping wife it was hardly possible that any natural defects in it should not be increased. The extreme sweetness of her temper must hurt his. He had all the clearness and quickness of mind which she wanted, and he could sometimes act an ungracious or say a severe thing. He was not a great favourite with his fair sister-in-law. Nothing wrong in him escaped her. She was quick in feeling little injuries to Isabella, which Isabella never felt herself. Perhaps she might have passed over more had his manners been flattering to Isabella's sister, but they were only those of a calmly kind brother and friend, without praise and without blindness, but hardly any degree of personal compliment could have made her regardless of that greatest fault of all in her eyes which he sometimes fell into, the want of respectful forbearance towards her father. There he had not always the patience that could have been wished. Mr. Woodhouse's peculiarities and fidgetiness were sometimes provoking him to a rational remonstrance or sharp retort equally ill bestowed. It did not often happen, for Mr. John Knightley had really a great regard for his father-in-law, and generally a strong sense of what was due to him, but it was too often for Emma's charity, especially as there was all the pain of apprehension frequently to be endured, though the offence came not. The beginning, however, of every visit displayed none but the properest feelings, and this being of necessity so short, might be hoped to pass away in unsullied cordiality. They had not been long seated and composed, when Mr. Woodhouse, with a melancholy shake of the head and a sigh, called his daughter's attention to the sad change at Hartfield since she had been there last. "Ah, my dear," said he, "poor Miss Taylor, it is a grievous business." "Oh yes, sir," cried she with ready sympathy, "how you must miss her, and dear Emma too. What a dreadful loss to you both. I've been so grieved for you. I could not imagine how you could possibly do without her. It is a sad change indeed. But I hope she is pretty well, sir." "Pretty well, my dear. I hope pretty well. I do not know but that the place agrees with her tolerably." Mr. John Knightley here asked Emma quietly whether there were any doubts of the air at Randalls. "Oh, no, none in the least. I never saw Mrs. Weston better in my life, never looking so well. Papa is only speaking his own regret." "Very much to the honour of both," was the handsome reply. "And do you see her, sir, tolerably often?" asked Isabella in the plaintive tone which just suited her father. Mr. Woodhouse hesitated. "Not near so often, my dear, as I could wish." "Oh, papa, we have missed seeing them but one entire day since they married. Either in the morning or evening of every day, excepting one, have we seen either Mr. Weston or Mrs. Weston, and generally both, either at Randalls or here, and as you may suppose, Isabella, most frequently here. They are very, very kind in their visits. Mr. Weston is really as kind as herself. Papa, if you speak in that melancholy way, you will be giving Isabella a false idea of us all. Everybody must be aware that Miss Taylor must be missed, but everybody ought to be assured that Mr. and Mrs. Weston do really prevent our missing her by any means to the extent we ourselves anticipated, which is the exact truth." "Just as it should be," said Mr. John Knightley, "and just as I hoped it was from your letters. Her wish of showing you attention could not be doubted, and his being a disengaged and social man makes it all easy. I've been always telling you, my love, that I'd no idea of the change being so very material to Hartfield as you apprehended, and now you have Emma's account, I hope you'll be satisfied." "Why, to be sure," said Mr. Woodhouse,
Yes, certainly, I cannot deny that Mrs. Weston, poor Mrs. Weston, does come and see us pretty often, but then she is always obliged to go away again."
"It would be very hard upon Mr. Weston if she did not, papa. You quite forget poor Mr. Weston."
"I think, indeed," said John Knightley pleasantly, "that Mr. Weston has some little claim. You and I, Emma, will venture to take the part of the poor husband. I, being a husband, and you not being a wife, the claims of the man may very likely strike us with equal force. As for Isabella, she has been married long enough to see the convenience of putting all the Mr. Westons aside as much as she can."
"Me, my love?" cried his wife, hearing and understanding only in part. "Are you talking about me? I am sure nobody ought to be or can be a greater advocate for matrimony than I am, and if it had not been for the misery of her leaving Hartfield, I should never have thought of Miss Taylor but as the most fortunate woman in the world. And as to slighting Mr. Weston, that excellent Mr. Weston, I think there is nothing he does not deserve. I believe he is one of the very best-tempered men that ever existed. Excepting yourself and your brother, I do not know his equal for temper. I shall never forget his flying Henry's kite for him that very windy day last Easter, and ever since his particular kindness last September 12-month in writing that note, at 12 o'clock at night, on purpose to assure me that there was no scarlet fever at Cobham, I have been convinced there could not be a more feeling heart, nor a better man in existence. If anybody can deserve him, it must be Miss Taylor."
"Where is the young man?" said John Knightley. "Has he been here on this occasion, or has he not?"
"He has not been here yet," replied Emma. "There was a strong expectation of his coming soon after the marriage, but it ended in nothing, and I have not heard him mentioned lately."
"But you should tell them of the letter, my dear," said her father. "He wrote a letter to poor Mrs. Weston to congratulate her, and a very proper, handsome letter it was. She showed it to me. I thought it very well done of him indeed. Whether it was his own idea, you know, one cannot tell. He is but young, and his uncle, perhaps—"
"My dear papa, he is 23. You forget how time passes."
23? Is he indeed? Well, I could not have thought it, and he was but 2 years old when he lost his poor mother. Well, time does fly indeed, and my memory is very bad. However, it was an exceeding good, pretty letter, and gave Mr. and Mrs. Weston a great deal of pleasure. I remember it was written from Weymouth, and dated September 28th, and began, 'My dear Madam,' but I forget how it went on, and it was signed F.C. Weston Churchill. I remember that perfectly."
"How very pleasing and proper of him!" cried the good-hearted Mrs. John Knightley. "I have no doubt of his being a most amiable young man. But how sad it is that he should not live at home with his father! There is something so shocking in a child's being taken away from his parents and natural home. I never could comprehend how Mr. Weston could part with him. To give up one's child, I really never could think well of anybody who proposed such a thing to anybody else."
"Nobody ever did think well of the Churchills, I fancy," observed Mr. John Knightley coolly. "But you need not imagine Mr. Weston to have felt what you would feel in giving up Henry or John. Mr. Weston is rather an easy, cheerful-tempered man than a man of strong feelings. He takes things as he finds them, and makes enjoyment of them somehow or other, depending, I suspect, much more upon what is called society for his comforts, that is, upon the power of eating and drinking, and playing whist with his neighbours 5 times a week, than upon family affection or anything that home affords."
Emma could not like what bordered on a reflection on Mr. Weston, and had half a mind to take it up, but she struggled and let it pass. She would keep the peace if possible, and there was something honourable and valuable in the strong domestic habits, the all-sufficiency of home to himself, whence resulted her brother's disposition to look down on the common rate of social intercourse, and those to whom it was important. It had a high claim to forbearance. End of chapter 11.
So in chapter 11, we got a chance to actually get a vibe on Isabella and John Knightley, Mr. Knightley's younger brother, who's married to Isabella, who is Emma's sister. We're going to talk about them in a minute, but I want to go back to the beginning of chapter 10. There's some nice callbacks at the beginning of this chapter. Harriet mentions she's never been within sight. She hasn't been to the vicarage before. And Emma could only class it as proof of love, with Mr. Elton seeing ready wit in her. So before, she's like, Elton in the poem talks about she having ready wit. And that was the one thing where Emma was like, yeah, no, I wouldn't call her someone with a ready wit. And so now she's being a little snarky in her indirect address about that as well. I thought it was interesting that once again we have the word repent. She talked before with Knightley about she can feel sorry, but she can't repent because repenting would require her to change her behavior. And she says, if I were to marry, I must expect to repent it, which would mean a change in her behavior. And then we get to Emma's descriptions, conversations about Mrs. Bates. And we're not talking about Mother Bates, we're talking about Miss Bates, younger one who is not a widow, who never got married before. And there's a line, I can't tell if this is snark or not. She says, never mind, Harriet, I will not be a poor old maid. And it is poverty only which makes celibacy contemptible to a generous public. There's an exclamation mark there. I don't know if she means generous, like in quotation marks, people who are poor and living on their own, the quote unquote generous public thinks of that in a contemptible way. I don't know. It feels like it might be that, but then she goes on to but a single woman of good fortune is always respectable and may be as sensible and pleasant as anybody else, which now just sounds like Emma talking Emma again. So I don't know if she had a flash of insight seeing the irony in the way society treats people, or if that's just Jane couldn't help herself, which is probably more likely. It is interesting that one of the distinctions she draws, so for a very narrow income has a tendency to contract the mind and sour the temper. That makes a lot of sense if you don't have enough money to have any leisure time or the finances to use the leisure time in a pleasant way. That certainly sours my temper. And it would contract the mind. Contract meaning, pull it in, be illiberal with your thinking. But then she goes on, and yes, she's kind of poking fun at Miss Bates, but she does say, poverty certainly hasn't contracted her mind. Now, that's partially an insult because Miss Bates is 100% interested in everybody else. She has no life, and therefore everybody else's life is fabulous and wonderful, and she loves hearing about it and reading about it and knowing what everybody else is doing. But then Emma follows that up with, I really believe if she had only a shilling in the world, she would be very likely to give away sixpence of it, which is a lovely thing to say, that she's very generous. And Emma recognizes this. She's very generous. She's generous of spirit. She's generous with this good nature, and nobody is afraid of her. And that is a great charm. I thought, oh, now that's an interesting one, right? Because nobody is afraid of her. Well, was anybody afraid of old maids? I mean, I suppose there's like a kind of the stereotype of the hag kind of image that you would see in fairy tales and things, and those are old women to be afraid of. But that seems, I don't know, that really struck me as being an interesting point being made and an interesting way to phrase that point. I don't know. I don't know what you guys think. Let me know if you want to call 206-350-1642, or you can follow our link to SpeakPipe at linktr.ee/CraftLit channel, and you can leave a voicemail for us using the web entirely. You wouldn't have to go, use your phone and spend money and stuff. The other thing that I think is interesting about these two chapters today is, as I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, Jane is older when she's writing this. She's heading into the end of her 30s and entering her 40s, and says, I do not perceive why I should be more in want of employment at 40 or 50 than at 1 and 20. This is somebody who has a little bit more perspective now. And the fact that she doesn't say that she would do carpet work as kind of a personal slam, it's just what you would do. It's something to do that is of use and value and is also very pretty. But then she goes into that, it's almost an entire paragraph on being an aunt and having many nieces and nephews. And the last line, I shall often have a niece with me. This was true. She had a niece, Anna, who was working towards becoming an author in her own right. And she had a nephew, Edward, who at some point during his childhood, so tween age, he realized that his Aunt Jane was the author of all of these famous books. So even if her name wasn't known, the titles of the books were clearly being discussed by people that he heard talking about it. So he was so impressed finding out that this was her that he wrote her a congratulatory poem. And I have to read it to you because it's just adorable. To Miss J. Austen. No words can express, my dear aunt, my surprise, or make you conceive how I opened my eyes, like a pig butcher pile has just struck with his knife, when I heard for the very first time in my life that I have the honor to have a relation whose works were dispersed through the whole of the nation. I assure you, however, I'm terribly glad. Oh dear, just to think, and the thought drives me mad, that dear Mrs. Jennings' good-natured strain was really the produce of your witty brain, that you made the Middletons, Dashwoods, and all, and that you, not young Ferrers, found out that a ball may be given in cottages never so small. And though Mr. Collins, so grateful for all, will Lady de Bourgh his dear patroness call, 'tis to your ingenuity really he owed his living, his wife, and his humble abode. Is that not just adorable? Oh my God, I love that. This is the nephew, Edward, who wound up writing a memoir about growing up with Jane Austen being your aunt. And he has nothing but lovely things to say about her, as do many of the extant letters that went around the family, but also the kids were writing to Jane themselves. Jane also wrote a very sweet letter to, I think it was Anna, who then became an aunt to another sibling's children at like the ripe old age of 10. And Jane wrote to her about how important it was to be a good aunt. And at the end of the letter, she signed it, your sister aunt. Sisters in auntiness. I just thought that was adorable. Then we get to Jane Fairfax. This is the first time in this book that Jane Fairfax gets mentioned by name, and we get a very clear picture of Emma's thinking about her, that she's probably just fine, but they're the same age. They're constantly getting thrown together if they're ever in the same place at the same time, with the expectation that they will be very good friends. And Emma has heard so much about how awesome Jane is from the Miss Bateses, and especially from Miss Bates, that she's really just sick of her. She's sick of her before Jane ever showed up. If you spend part of your lifetime being compared to another sibling or a cousin or some other close member of the family, why can't you be more like this person? It wears thin after a while. And I think that's the root of Emma's reaction to Jane Fairfax in general. I also liked that when Emma and Harriet pay a visit to the family that's poverty-stricken and living in Highbury, but obviously on hard times, she is not Mrs. Jellyby from Bleak House. She is not talking a good line, but then doing nothing. Jane is very clear that Emma isn't judgy about these people. She understands their situation, and she does everything she can to alleviate as much as she can of their suffering. It's different than, and I'm not casting aspersions here at all, it's different than going and serving Thanksgiving dinner at a homeless shelter, something that you do once a year. This is much more a vocation for Emma. This is something she does regularly. This is something that she certainly expected to do, but also it seems like this is a job of hers, a job that she takes very seriously and that she does remarkably well. And yet, as they're walking away, she's like, wow, that really hits. But you know, who can say how long it's going to stick in my mind? How long am I going to actually remember the lessons I've learned from this situation? It could all just disappear the next thought that I have that distracts me, which at first I was like, wow, that's kind of callous. And then I thought, no, actually, that's pretty honest. I don't think any of us would like to think that that's how we react when we've gone and volunteered somewhere or done some kind of an act of charity. It's certainly not, doesn't take forever before the experience leaves your front of mind. But then she sets into it again and says, and actually, I don't think the impression will be soon over. I do not think it will. She says this over and over again. And then there's an interesting piece of punctuation, which we will show you on the screen on the YouTube video, and you will have a screenshot of it on the show notes for the audio version. Harriet, there comes a very sudden trial of our stability in good thoughts. They see Mr. Elton coming. Well, comma, parentheses, smiling, close parentheses. I hope it may be allowed that if compassion has produced exertion and relief to the sufferers, it has done all that is truly important. I hope we did good things. If we feel for the wretched enough to do all we can for them, we've done what we can. The rest is empty sympathy, only distressing to our own selves. And again, I started to think, wow, that's kind of harsh too. And then I thought, no, that's actually, I think many of us suffer from compassion overwhelm or compassion paralysis, that there's only so much any one person can do to help make the world a better place. And if you're the kind of person who hates to see other people in need or in discomfort or struggling, you do everything you can to help them. I mean, take a look at what you can do, examine your situation, do what you can, and then let it go. Which doesn't mean let it go forever. It means let it go until next week when you come over again, bringing food and love and flowers and whatever. It actually makes a lot of sense. That's a bit of wisdom that I'm finding these moments of Emma's insights to all be very much, she says something that sounds good, and then it's followed by something that sounds harsh, but maybe not so much. And I don't remember that happening so much in Persuasion, maybe a little in Sense and Sensibility. And I don't remember it happening a lot in Pride and Prejudice. But as I said, I'm going to have to go back and redo that book. So who knows what I will find then. I did notice she has brought a picture so that the child in the family, so 8, 9, 10, 11, the child could go to her home, Hartsfield, and pick up a pitcher full of soup, of broth. And there's a lot of culinary interactions that go on between the different households in Highbury. There's this instance. There are going to be more, the closer we get to the middle of the book, you're going to hear more and more about people who have orchards or people who have strawberries in a greenhouse or an enclosed space. That this kind of sharing of the bounty is very much part of their social structure and the interdependent nature of this society, which I think we get that much, much more clearly here than in any of her other novels for lots of reasons. But I think it is an interesting thing to note here. I thought at the beginning of chapter 11, there was some fun free and direct speech. Emma's kind of frustrated that Elton isn't making a move faster with Harriet and realizes she just has to give them some space because her sister is coming with her family and Emma's not going to have any time to be working on that. But then she decides that that's okay. There are people who, the more you do for them, the less they will do for themselves, which, oh, Emma, if you'd only listen to your own advice. But that's very much one of those moments where it's Emma's brain making the commentary on the situation. I do love those. I love that the 5 children is called a competent number of, or the 5 children are accompanied by a competent number of nursery maids, which I love. And I think this is the passage, this is the section that gave the movie makers of the most recent version of Emma the idea to make Isabella the kind of wreck that she is, and Mr. John Knightley a little bit more henpecked and tired than I think he is, which is not to say that they aren't those things. because it is described here. But you get Isabella described as very delicate in her own health, over careful of her children, had many fears and many nerves, like Miss Bennet, and even in North and South in Elizabeth Gaskell's book, we see that. And she was just as fond of her own apothecary, Mr. Wingfield, as much as Mr. Perry is a fondness of Mr. Woodhouse. And then she says, they are alike too, Mr. Woodhouse and Isabella. They were alike too in a general benevolence of temper and a strong habit of regard for every old acquaintance. So, yes, they're self-involved in that nervousness way, but they're not self-involved like Mr. Fairley in The Woman in White. She's not so self-involved that she can't notice that other people are there or might need something. Certainly her focus is mostly on her kids. But then Mr. John Knightley, Emma's pretty clear. She's like, well, maybe I would like him better, but I understand the digs that he's making at Isabella. She's not catching it, but I am. And that irks me. But really, she could let anything go, except that sometimes he's a little short with Mr. Woodhouse. And Emma is not there for that. She is not having any of it. And she says, had his manners been more flattering to Isabella's sister, Emma, it would be different, but they were only those of a calmly kind brother and friend, without praise and without blindness, which sounds like a Mr. Knightley as well as a Mr. John Knightley quite clearly. One of the places where I think we see that part of the good side of the Woodhouses, we saw Mr. Woodhouse got James, his driver, a good position for his daughter, a safe place to work, and a nearby one, which he's doing for selfish reasons. It keeps James there and working for him, so that doesn't have to change. But also, that's just a really stand-up thing to do. But now we get Isabella talking about Mr. Weston, and they're not particularly close, right? I mean, Isabella's been married for quite a while. She's not there very often. She lives in London, but she does go back with specifics. There was that particular kindness last September, 12 months, so a year ago, in writing that note at 12 o'clock at night on purpose to assure me that there was no scarlet fever at Cobham, which is a not too far away town. And he helped Henry fly a kite on that very windy day last Easter. These are specific moments of kindness that she's registered and ticked off. And I think that's one of the things that gets lost in the way she is portrayed in movie versions. And also, I am pretty confident that I glossed right over that the first couple of times I read the book. I didn't catch as many of these individual human interactions that are getting clocked by people like Mr. Woodhouse and Isabella. That damn letter is showing up again. The letter from Frank Churchill gets talked about once more, and Isabella is right there with Miss Bates. Oh, it's a lovely letter. It's a handsome letter. It's all these things. But I don't know how Mr. Weston could part with Frank. To give up one's child, I really never could think well of anybody who proposed such a thing to anybody else. And Mr. John Knightley says, nobody ever did think well of the Churchills, I fancy, which is as clear a statement as we're going to get on the Churchills. I mean, we already know the history of the kind of proud Miss Churchill, who was Mr. Weston's first wife, and how that did not work out so well for anybody. But yeah, I don't think anybody did think well of the Churchills. But then Emma's about to argue with him about Mr. Weston, and then lets it pass. She's like, I'm going to be the grown-up in the room. I will let it pass and keep the peace. And she says, and there was something honorable and valuable in the strong domestic habits, the all-sufficiency of home to himself, whence resulted his brother's disposition to look down on the common rate, down on the way society has expectations about social intercourse, and those to whom it was important. He's more about his family, the domestic sphere, than he is about society and being social outside of home. And that's nice. That's a nice place to end it. And that's the last line. It had a high claim for forbearance. That alone, how much John Knightley values his home and his family is a reason to let it go and not get mad at him. And that is it for this week. I hope you liked chapters 10 and 11 of Emma. If you are one of the 2 winners for the raffle, by the time this airs, you should have heard from me. So check your email and spam folder if you didn't. Oh, one thing I keep forgetting to show you guys. I don't know, I can't remember if I told you, but Aiden Thing 2 has gotten into Pratt. And that's an art school in Brooklyn, New York City that is really awesome. And they have a smaller 2-year campus upstate. So they went and visited Pratt Munson. So that's their little sticker for their anime club. But then the thing that Aiden said was just the best part was that they also have an old people club. And an old people club is for people who like to sit around and knit and crochet and talk as they do it. And that just made me so happy. So unreasonably happy. But I thought I would show those to you. You can see them on the YouTube channel, or you can take a look at the photograph of these that are on the show notes. All right, you take care of yourself. Have a good one. I will talk to you soon. Take care. Bye. If you like what we do here, please consider liking and subscribing on iTunes, thumbs upping and subscribing on YouTube. You can visit patreon.com/craftlit and become a patron of this art. And you can always go to Linktree, linktr.ee/craftlit channel. And from there, you can get links out to all of the social media, all of the places that CraftLit lives. It's a nice hub that you can go to get all the stuff, all the good stuff. And I keep forgetting to mention, we also have a Facebook group with the loveliest group of people, as you might imagine. They're just awesome, makers and readers, and people who hadn't been readers before, but are now. I like that. All right, you take care of yourself. Have a great one. I'll talk to you soon. Bye.